On the night of 14 October 1939, Captain Lieutenant Nather Preen took U-47 into Scapa Flow, the British fleet anchorage every Admiralty textbook said no submarine could enter. Channels blockaded, boom defenses across the approaches, tidal rips that turned boats. Preen called U-47 to periscope depth, slipped in on the dim lights of the fleet at anchor, and fired 4 torpedoes into Hoom's Royal Oak at her moorings. The battleship broke in half and went down with 1,234 men aboard. The Harbor Watch first saw the boat as she was leaving. The deadliest naval weapon in history had just announced itself in a coffin that called the Atlantic home. A coffin made of iron. To understand why German U-boat crews ever called the Atlantic an iron coffin, you first have to look at the hull. 67.1 meters of welded steel, 769 tons surfaced, 48 men on the smaller type, 52 on the larger. The boat was the Type Vic, the working horse of the German Kriegsmarine. 2 surface diesel engines at her shoulders pushed her at 17 knots. Banks of heavy electric batteries and electric motors kept her alive below the surface at 7 knots for short hours at a time. 4 torpedo tubes forward, 2 aft, 23 ordnance weight torpedoes sometimes. Single hulled through cold water, all the way down. Forward of the radio room, in a leather case cooled by nothing but its own healthy vibration, sat an Enigma machine. Every operational U-boat carried one. Every operational U-boat used it for every message. 5,318 finely machined parts, and every part of it busy encoding the same air the boat was sending home. You do not fight it the way it wants to be fought, but the boat itself was a coffin 220 feet long, and the men aboard would in time begin to say so. But it still needed a name. A name for the coffin. Eiserner Sarg, the iron coffin, was the men's phrase, not the Navy's, and that is a small fact worth holding on to. The label was put on the coffin by the men who had to sleep inside it every night of every patrol. The Reich Propaganda Office did not give the phrase to the public. The Reich Propaganda Office, famously, painted the boats as romantic goddess iron hunters who rode the North Atlantic for the Frere and the Fatherland. The Kriegsmarine gave the boats professional names: Sturm, Jagd, Greif Storm, Hunt, Grief, names of war, not of death. The men who served aboard them, in the hours no press officer could see, named their coffin for the property of iron, unalterable, indifferent, sealed, by 1969, when former Oberleutnant Zur C. Herbert Werner published his memoir Iron Coffins, A U-Boat Commander's War, 1939-45. The name had been carried into its afterlife. The phrase became, over the decades that followed, the only self-given name the U-boat ever had. But no nickname ever fit a wider death roll. The men inside the coffin step onto a Type Vic on her second week at sea, and you step into a greenhouse run by men who cannot open the windows. Interior temperature ran day and night, surfaced or submerged, between 35 and 40 degrees Celsius. Diesel fumes never quite cleared the aft compartments. Cooking smells competed with them, but neither won. The noise of the running diesels was its own weather. The silence of the batteries below the surface was its own weather too, and worse, because silence on a U-boat almost always meant the boat was hiding, and almost always meant a destroyer was somewhere above. Each man was allotted 1.5 liters of fresh water per day for drinking, washing, and shaving. They did not bathe. Showers were a memory of peacetime. Meals were what the quartermaster could heat in a single cast iron pot. Canned sausage, dried bread, ersatz coffee that came back up easily. The most coveted spot on the boat was not the captain's chair. It was the bunk nearest the torpedo tube hatch, where a breath of fresh air came in. Hands calloused from grease and seawater, eyes that had forgotten the color of grass, voices that had forgotten how to speak above a whisper. The toilet, that single detail you just held on to, was the same single toilet for 48 men who all wanted it in the same hour. When it backed up on the night of a depth charge run, the crew used the booby cot, a bucket with a lid, set carefully in a corner of the control room, in the same compartment where the chief of the watch had to give his orders. There was no place on a type-thick where a man could be alone with his own sickness. There was no place anywhere on a U-boat that was not shared with 37 other men, their sweat, their smoke, their fear, their breath, one atmosphere, one humidity, one air. Hold that. You will see exactly why by the end of this story. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm during the war, about 28,000 never came home. That is a casualty rate of roughly 70% and upward, depending on which compilation you take. 3 dead of every 4 who had set foot aboard. Higher, by some modern reckonings, than any other branch of any major service in the war. But even a 70% casualty rate was not, on its own, the price that lost the war. The boats were still sinking ships. A doctrine called Triumph, the word for the doctrine, was Rudeltaktik Wolfpack Tactics, and Admiral Karl Dönitz had been refining it for a decade before the war even came. The idea was simple, and simple ideas are the ones that kill. One boat would find a convoy. It would not attack. It would shadow, by day, just beyond the convoy's horizon, and radio a contact report back to U-boat headquarters at Lorient on the French Atlantic coast. Other boats would converge, by night, on the contact report's coordinates. They would attack on the surface, in numbers no convoy escort could handle at once. They would vanish before dawn. They would do this again the next night, and the next, and the next. And the men escorting the merchant ships would go to their stations, knowing that tomorrow night, or the night after, would almost certainly come again. Nitz, in his headquarters, was conducting the war from a single screen of contact reports, and that screen was, in a way, about to become the screen that killed him. In the first 4 months of 1942 alone, German U-boats sank 1,302,949 tons of Allied shipping. In 120 days, the equivalent of every cargo ship in a mid-sized navy had been sent to the bottom. By the late summer of 1942, the Wolfpacks had reached American waters and, blacked out along the East Coast and in the Caribbean, had begun what survivors on land called the second happy time, when the boats hunted so close to New York and Norfolk and Atlantic City that beachgoers could read the silhouettes and watch the smoke. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank 871 Allied ships. Britain, in those months, came within weeks of being starved out. The island ran on imports. The Wolfpacks were cutting the rope, knot by knot, ship by ship, but every contact report was a message sent through the air. And every message is a thread someone, somewhere, may learn to pull. You remember the rotors in the leather case. Hold that. It will matter. The anchorage that sold a generation the boats had a recruitment poster before they had a doctrine. It came on the night of 14 October 1939. Preen took U-47 into Scapa Flow, the British fleet anchorage in the Orkney Islands, the same harbor in which the High Seas Fleet had surrendered 21 years earlier. Every Admiralty textbook in Britain said no submarine could enter. Channels were blockaded. Boom defenses stretched across the approaches. Preen guided her by a single look at the dim lights of the fleet at anchor. He fired 4 torpedoes into Ms. Royal Oak. The battleship broke in half and went down with 1,234 men aboard, including several hundred boys of the training squadron sleeping not far from where the torpedoes hit. In one night, Preen had done the reportedly impossible. the propaganda ministry put his face on the front page of every newspaper in Germany. The Navy gave him the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. By the summer of 1941, boys who had never been inside a U-boat wanted, suddenly, to sign the enlistment card. It was not Scapa Flow itself that recruited the generation. It was the Boast. It was the silent boat slipping the harbor that in photo and in word made the Coffin look like a throne. But the anchorage that let him in would, over time, become the anchorage no boat returned to. The turn on 1st February 1942, the Kriegsmarine added a fourth rotor to the operational Enigma machine on the U-boat network. That single modification, one extra wheel, broke every Allied code-breaking gain since 1939. Bletchley Park went dark, and what became known as the Blackout. For 10 long months, the Allies could not read a single operational U-boat message. The Wolfpacks knew it. The hunters were blind in Oxford, but the hunters across the ocean could see clearly again. Then came the night of 30 October 1942. Lieutenant Anthony Fasson of Mspetard had already boarded the sinking U-559 when he slid down into the flooded casing, with the water already above his boots. Inside the boat, 3 Enigma rotors sat in a small leather case. Fasson passed them up, hand over hand, in the dark and the rising water. The rotors in his hands were cold. The water was at his chest by the time he had handed the third one up. The leather case was heavier than the rest of his life. His shipmate, able seaman Colin Grasher, took them onto the bridge. Fasson and a petty officer beside him went down with the boat. The rotors were recovered. Britain got them back. The 4-rotor blackout broke. At the same time, in a different theater of the same quiet war, Coastal Command was learning to see in the dark. On 5 July 1942, a Coastal Command Wellington of 172 Squadron took off from Raff, Iceland, carrying a strange new fixture under its wing, the Lee Light, a 1-ton searchlight locked beside the bomb bay. Its pilot was Pilot Officer Wiley B. Howell, an American volunteer serving in the Royal Air Force. East of Newfoundland, Howell's Wellington found U-502 on the surface, charging batteries. The Lee Light came on. U-502 was caught, lit, and destroyed in the open. Kelvon Rosenstahl's U-502 went down with all 52 hands. Howell received a DFC for making the first confirmed Lee Light kill. By the spring of 1943, the Allies were no longer simply defending convoys. They were hunting the hunters. Task Group 22-3, the same formation that would later capture U-505 intact on 4 June 1944 off the West African coast, was already sharpening its teeth in the early months of 1943, and the boats they were hunting knew it before the boats they were not. Allied depth charge totals doubled inside 12 months. But one bad month was still ahead. If you have stayed with us this far, and if you want to see what happens next, hit subscribe right now, because what happens next is the month the hunters stopped sailing home. Do not go anywhere. The month they stopped sailing home, May 1943. In 31 days, U-Boat Command lost 41 boats sunk at sea, with 3 more lost in port to accidents and bombing. Some sources place the figure slightly higher. That small unnamed difference is itself a kind of detail, because it shows how fast the boats were vanishing. Some were depth charged by escorts who had read the contact report the U-boat had just sent. Some were bombed by aircraft lit by a Lee Light halfway down the sky. Some were rammed. Some simply disappeared into the deep and were never heard from again. The losses came in clusters. On the morning of 6 May, 3 boats failed to report from mid-Atlantic. On 12 May, 4 went down in a single night of convoy escort action. By the close of May, the boats that had sailed the Atlantic in March were, by casualty ratio alone, effectively gone. And this was the deeper lesson. The U-boat had not been defeated because the Allies had built a better submarine. They had not. The U-boat had been defeated because the Allies had built a better system. Codebreakers, convoy escorts, aircraft, radar, every one of them reaching into the dark by a different arm, and the arm that had held the dark for 4 years finally tired. The previous monthly record for U-boat losses was 19. 41 nearly doubled it. On convoy SC-130 alone, a single convoy fought through an attack by roughly 20 U-boats and lost none of its merchant ships, while Allied escorts and aircraft sank 5 of the boats sent against it. 5 hunts, 5 kills, no losses to the convoy. The arithmetic broke. Confidence broke. The Dönitz calculus, which had held since 1940, broke clean in two. You are now seeing exactly why, by the end of this story, that single detail from the inside of the boat matters. Because 41 coffins in 31 days is the moment the name stopped being carried and started being carried out. On the night of 24 May 1943, Admiral Dönitz withdrew his operational U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The drumbeat on the Atlantic, as he himself had called the pulse of his Wolfpack doctrine, fell silent. The weapon that had nearly starved Britain was, by order of its own commander, kept out of the waters where Britain lived. What the Coffin became, the smell, the heat, the bunk-by-bunk hiss you remember from inside the Typevik, once the forge of an empire's terror, now became the inside of a sealed box on a seabed the boats could no longer reach. The Coffin was not made of iron in the end. It was made of every number above. The sea was not what killed them that night. England, fighting back, was, of Germany's roughly 842 operational and training U-boats, the run of sourcebooks places losses at closer to 779 sunk in the war. The surviving boats were surrendered at sea in May 1945 and were scuttled together in Operation Regenbogen in late 1945, nearly 1,000 iron coffins, at last count, in the cold dark of the Atlantic. He did not yet know the Allies had already read his weather report. He did not yet know that across the channel, leaf by leaf, a quiet officer in a quiet office was feeding every signal he sent into a machine whose answer was death. He did not yet know that what had looked to him like the open Atlantic was in fact the inside of a closing trap, and that every morning for months his boat had been listened to in a country he had never seen. They called it iron because they had to call it something, and the truth would not fit in any language they had left. Legacy: the fall of the U-boat became the foundation of modern anti-submarine warfare. Every modern sonar doctrine, without exception, descends in a direct line from the lessons of May 1943. Every convoy routing practiced the routes that hug coastlines, the evasive turns. The zigzag at dusk descends from those lessons too. Every aircraft delivered torpedo training protocol, every hunter-killer group formation drilled today in any navy on Earth, descends from those lessons too. The lesson did not have to be relearned in 1952 or 1982 or any decade since. In NATO fleets today, every new watch officer learns the Atlantic of May 1943 in his first year at sea. The submarine that does not know the lesson is a submarine that does not long survive. The weapon is gone, the principle remains. Every coffin is a shape the war hands you before it hands you the lid. Why they called the Atlantic itself the Coffin, the title on the front of this story, was not the boat. The title was the Atlantic, the experience of being inside the boat while the boat was in the Atlantic, and they called the Atlantic itself a coffin. That distinction is the most important detail of the whole story. The coffin was made of iron in the hull. The coffin was made of iron in the bulkheads. But the coffin was, most of all, the experience itself, the temperature, the silence of the batteries, the noise of the diesels, the smells of diesel and sweat and the booby-cot on the day of a depth charge run, the taste of canned sausage and ersatz coffee, the smell of a bunk whose warm air had been left by the previous man, and, After May 1943, the Coffin often returned the boat to a base where the boat would be oiled, but the men who came off her would not become the men they had been. The boat was made of iron. The iron entered the men. The man inside the boat became, by the second week of his second patrol, a different kind of man. He did not yet know it. The Allied escorts at sea did not yet know it, but the men on his own boat knew it because they had to live with him. The title Returned U came here to ask why German U-boat crews called the Atlantic an iron coffin. The answer, if you sit with it, is this. It was loud and then it was silent. It smelled of diesel and of fear. 67.1 meters of steel, 48 men, one working toilet, and nowhere left to hide. The engines stopped, the lights dimmed, the orders stopped, because there were no more orders that meant anything. There was nothing to do, no place to go, no one to speak to in the dark and the noise and the cold water rising at your boots, and no way out. It is not a moment most men would write home about. The men on the boat had stopped writing home, of course. They were alive and silent, or they were dead and silent, and there was no third category. Every coffin is a shape the war hands you before it hands you the lid. If you want the next story before anyone else, hit subscribe so you do not miss it. Turn on the bell notifications, because every week we tell you how America actually won its war. Drop a like if this one earned it. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one.